Good morning, friends. Welcome to Easter Sunday. It is the highest, holiest day of our year. I wish we could all be together in person. I wish we could be in this room. I wish we could exchange hugs. I wish we could do photos in our Easter finery and dress up and all those different traditions. I wish we could have kids doing Easter egg hunts outside. But we can't. But what we can do is what Christians have done for thousands of years. On Easter Sunday, come together. And there's this tradition of me leading by saying something like this: Christ is risen from the dead. And you reply, he is risen indeed. Now, I'm going to say both parts because it's going to be really quiet in here with just me if I don't, but you can reply at home. You can say it in your heart if you don't want to say it out loud, but it's so much better said out loud. So here we go. Christ is risen from the dead. He is risen indeed. This is the point of our story, but it's not where we're going to start. We're going to start back before that. So on Good Friday, for those of you that were with us, we read one psalm 3 times, Psalm 22. And in each devotion, we read this psalm to let it resonate with us. And today, we're going to read 3 psalms, 1 time each. So we're going to start with Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusted in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. This is the Psalm of the Cross, Psalm 22. We're going to read that one and 23 and 24. The second 2 are Psalms of the Resurrection. They go together. They're there for a purpose. They have this beautiful pattern to them. But in our story, Jesus is dead to begin with. That's how we start. Jesus has died a failure. Everything is over. And we've just had Holy Saturday, the day in between, and that is a day that's always fascinated me. It seems like the worst day. Sometimes I think the day after the worst day, or the one you think will be the worst day, is actually worse than the worst day. For those of you that have been through grief, it's going through a funeral. And then there's the day after. There's the day after when everyone's gone home. No one's calling anymore. They've left you to your grief, maybe. Maybe it's the day after a divorce is finalized. There's those days that come after and nobody's showing their care and you suddenly feel alone. And there's a chance in those days that you wake up and for a second in that moment between sleep and awake, you imagine that everything's fine. And then it all comes flooding back. No, it's not fine. And this is where these disciples are walking right now. The followers of Jesus, the earliest followers, the core of 12, they're sat right there on Holy Saturday. And there's nothing. Now, traditionally, a Jewish person would go to the synagogue on Saturday, but how can they go back? With Jesus, they may have gone. They went all the time and heard him unpack these truths about God in ways that they couldn't possibly have understood before. They're mesmerized as this incredible teacher teaches in a way that no one else has taught. But more than that, he's opened the eyes of blind men. He's raised people from the dead. He's healed the sick. And all the time, he's whispered to them this secret. It's called the Messianic secret. I'm doing this thing. I'm going to change everything. Now, they haven't understood it, but it's got to have been exciting. And now, to imagine going back without Jesus, to imagine going to a synagogue without Jesus, how can they go? And how can they go when the Roman authorities might well be looking for them? They're known as followers of Jesus. How can they leave? The best they can hope for is to hide. Maybe they can go back to their old lives, but that just seems empty too. So they're left with this day, Saturday, this day of just nothing, where the future just seems a mystery. What's it going to look like? And I think of all people, we maybe understand that a little right now. Maybe you feel like this time that we're in is this time of just, what does tomorrow look like? One of my favorite shows is The Simpsons. And I've seen the first 10 seasons of The Simpsons more times than I can count. I know it so well I can fall asleep to it on my iPad. And I can quote it pretty much verbatim. Whole episodes I can just quote from start to finish. And there's this one moment where Homer Simpson, the hero of the show, comes down to breakfast and he opens the paper and he reads the morning horoscope and it says, "Today will be a day just like any other." And he cries out, it just gets worse and worse. And maybe that's what you feel about right now. Maybe there's that sense of like, I really need it to get back to normal. I need to get my hair cut. I need to not have my husband cut it or my wife cut it because it's not looking good. I need to get back to my job. I need my kids to go back to school. I need to hug my grandkids, and I need normalcy. And we're stuck in that Holy Saturday. It's not the worst day, but it's just we're stuck. Or maybe we're like the disciples. Maybe we're scared. Maybe we're fearful. What if the worst thing happens? What if the virus finds me? All those different emotions might be going on right now, and some of them just mirror the emotions that these earliest disciples would have had. It's a horrible day, and it's always fascinated me just to sit and think, what would they have been thinking? And then you move to Sunday, the day after the worst day after the worst day. And this part of the story is fascinating. Because the disciples, these early group of men that follow Jesus, they stay. But there's two groups of people following Jesus. There's the guys, and then there's a group of women that have followed him as well. It talks about how they've supported his ministry, they've funded it, they've given money for food and for lodging, and they've followed him everywhere, taking care of his needs. They have loved him and has been as close to him as the earliest 12 guy followers in some ways. And they're the ones that on Sunday, they get up and go. Now, we could be really charitable and say that the guys maybe were at more risk. The Romans knew who they were. They'd been seen with Jesus teaching in the temple courts. They maybe were hunted men. Maybe we could say that the women might feel like they could slip under the radar better and go to the tomb unobserved. But it might be truer just to say the women were braver than the men. And when Sunday comes, they get up and go. They don't really have purpose in the sense, there's never really any hint in this story that any of Jesus' followers, guy or girl, has ever thought, maybe you'll come back from the dead. They all seem to have forgotten that he said this multiple times. This seems to have completely escaped them. But at least there is the fact they can go and do a last kindness. All their dreams are over. In the same way Jesus said it is finished, their dreams are finished. That kingdom, that secret that they talked about, it's done. It can't happen without Jesus. And so they go, not so much out of hope of anything, but just to do a last kindness, to take his body, to wrap it in new burial clothes, to perfume it, and then to leave it in a borrowed tomb. Jesus has died a failure. He doesn't even own his own grave. They'll go and they'll leave him there. But what awaits them is just so different. What awaits them is a tomb that's empty. What awaits them is a tomb with an angel sitting outside saying he is not dead, he is not here, he's alive. And just for a second, the story hovers. The story hovers with these three women that have gone to the tomb, that are too scared to tell anyone, and won't be believed even if they do. This story just waits, and you're kind of left with this moment of like, is that how it's going to stop? Are they just not going to say anything? And it just pauses there, just hangs in the balance. And so we'll leave it there for a second, and we'll go back and we'll talk about Psalm 23 and talk about this whole thing from Jesus' point of view. From the disciples' point of view, it's awful. But what's going on in Jesus' mind? Jesus' mind isn't Psalm 22. In some ways, it's Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Jesus has walked into death. And death is a shadow, in the sense of a shadow has been something that's a little scary, especially to a kid. Death can be scary. I remember growing up, the bus route to school would take me past a graveyard. So every morning on the bus, we'd get to this point where the graveyard started. And so what I would do is when we got there, just before the bus drove past the graveyard, I would hold my breath. I would take a big in-breath and hold it till we got past. And it wasn't a small graveyard. It took some time to get there. The worst mornings were the mornings where there was a huge traffic jam, because then I'd be stuck just trying to hold my breath thinking, I've got to get past this thing. But something about the graveyard itself scared me, because the idea of death scared me. That's why we have the phrase whistling past the graveyard. And whether you whistle past it, or whether you hold your breath past it, or you run past it, death is a scary thing to us. And that's probably normal. There's this passage tucked away back early in the Bible. A book called Ecclesiastes says this: "You have made everything beautiful in your time. You have set eternity in the hearts of man." There's this idea that God has a beginning, not so much a beginning, he always was, but his early stuff is way, way, way back there, and there's all this stuff in front of him, and we're stuck in this little bit of unit of time, and we don't feel like, we feel trapped in that. It feels like it should be bigger. It feels like it shouldn't end. And it shouldn't. That's why it feels weird. We were made to not die. It's really hard to talk about this Jesus story, this Easter story, without talking about an earlier story, without talking about Adam's story. Adam's story is connected to that Easter story. You can't talk about one without the other. They're that closely linked. Adam's story, and whether you think Adam is a myth, you've heard of Adam and Eve and the garden story is important because it just shows us that why we have that sense of death being a wrong fit, why death doesn't make sense to us. Adam is born into a garden, and he's made to be there forever. He's made to live forever with God, in relationship with God, and he ruins that by his own choices in the same way that we ruin our lives by poor choices so often. But his have much longer lasting consequences. Those consequences aren't just for him, but passed down to all of us. He takes a garden and he turns it into a grave. Remember that. He takes his garden and he turns it into a grave. Adam, who's made to not die, will now at some point die. Adam, who is made to not die, will at some point die. That's where our sense of death being a wrong fit, death not being what we're made for, comes from. We're not made for that. And so when we walk into it, we walk into it terrified so often. And yet Jesus, in this Psalm 23 tradition, walks into it with no fear at all. Bob Goff, the writer, in his beautiful way, talks about the death at the cross from Jesus' point of view. Talks about how everyone else panics. Everyone else thinks it's the worst thing that could happen. But he says heaven just began counting to 3. 1, 2, 3. Jesus walks into death with this confidence. Something's about to happen. There's some element of the story that we don't understand. How can you walk into death with that sense of it's going to be fine? How can you get from Psalm 22 to Psalm 23? How can you get from my God, why have you forsaken me into I walk through the valley of the shadow of death and I will not fear? Now, to help us understand this, we need to get a little bit nerdy. I definitely have a nerdy side. So I love church history, and you may not care about what happened to the church a week ago, let alone thousands of years ago. But sometimes it's useful. So church history tells us this. At one point, there was one church worldwide. And then there was this big split around 1000 BC, over 1000 AD. About 1,000 years ago, there was this big split between Eastern Church and Western Church. So the Western Church, which becomes the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, and a lot of us are part of the Protestant tradition or have been part of the Catholic tradition. Some of us still are part of that Catholic tradition. That church focuses on talking about what Jesus is doing and what his death means in a term of ransom, of paying a debt. So think about student debts. There's that conversation at the moment. Should we forgive all student debt? The conversation for them in terms of Jesus' death has been Jesus came and paid for our sins. He made it possible for us to have a relationship with God, even though we shouldn't have been able to. He covered the debt. And that's definitely in there. There's parts of the Bible that talk about that. But it's not the only thing that's there. And this Eastern church, while that conversation was going on, had another conversation altogether. They talked about Jesus' death, not being about paying a debt, but about winning a victory. It was about a victory. Jesus came to die to do something. I'm going to take that nerdy history side of me and match it with another nerdy side of me, which is my Star Wars side of me. There's that moment in The Return of the Jedi where the rebels come to attack the Empire, and Admiral Akbar, the guy that looks kind of like a fish, has this moment where he realizes the Death Star is still operational. He says, it's a trap. And it's a famous line, and I'll probably find a little clip of it just to throw up here while I'm talking. But this Jesus story is that in reverse. In this story, the good guys are the one that are setting a trap. Jesus is the trap or bait. What do I mean by that? For a second, let's talk about fishing. It will help us understand it. I went fishing with my wife a few years ago. We went up to her family's lake house in Minnesota, and her family were happily fishing with bait for bluegill and bass, and I wanted to catch a pike. I'd never caught one before. They always seem really scary, so I got out a lure, and I spent some time trying to trap a pike with a lure. And I'd try different ones to see which would work, and finally I caught one. It looked really big at the time, but in the picture it doesn't look as big as I remember. And then my father-in-law caught one that was twice as big and has not let me forget it. But fishing in that way is all about finding the right bait. Back early in the Bible, in this book called Proverbs, the writer says this: death and the grave are insatiable. Insatiable in their love for human beings, or their desire for human beings. Death will be there for every single one of us at some point. No human being has ever not died. When the Eastern Church, this church over this side, when they talked about what Jesus did, they talked about the idea that Jesus came to be part of a trap. Jesus came to trap death. Check out this passage from Hebrews that I'm going to read you. It says this: but we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor, because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Since the children, that's you and I, have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death. To the Eastern Church, Jesus dying was a victory over death. That's why in Eastern churches all over the world, on this day, which for them is actually a week after, they'll have this thing of crying over and over again, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling over death by death, and on those in the tombs, bestowing life. Jesus is a victor. So in Eastern churches, you'll see pictures of Jesus' resurrection. And in the Western church, when he's raised from the dead, he's always alone. But in the Eastern church, he's always with someone. And this picture right here shows Jesus, and he's standing on the gates of hell. And he holds, one hand he holds Adam, and one hand he holds Eve. And he's bringing them with him. Resurrection isn't a solo thing. Resurrection is about everybody. And this is what's happening. It's a victory. Jesus dying is a victory over death. That's what the Eastern Church celebrates. And it's a huge part of theology that we as a Western church miss, but it's so important. Jesus is changing the narrative. And that leads us to Psalm 24, our next psalm, that says this: lift up your heads, you gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, you gates. Lift them up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord Almighty. He is the King of glory. Psalm 22 talks about, my God, how could you forsake me? Psalm 23 talks about walking through a valley of death's shadow. Psalm 24 talks about the victory of a king, this Lord, God Almighty. He is the King of glory. Jesus is a victor over death. He's changed the whole story. Now think about that just for a second in terms of our earlier conversation. Adam takes a garden and turns it into a grave. Watch what happens with Jesus in this moment. We're going to look in the story, the Bible story in John. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into his tomb. The two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked a woman, "Why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I do not know where they have put him." At this, she turned round and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Adam takes a garden and he turns it into a grave. And Jesus, in this incredible moment, he takes a grave and he turns it into a garden. She says she thought he was the gardener, and she's not wrong. Jesus has flipped the whole story on its end. He's flipped the script, because forever in history, life for human beings ended in death, and that was the end. And in Jesus' case, it looked like everything was the same, that the story was the same. His body went cold the same as everybody else. And there was a reason that he waited 3 days to come back from the dead, because in Jewish culture, that was the amount of time that the spirit hovered around the body. He waited just long enough for that to be done, for there to be no possibility of a comeback. And then that's the moment that he comes back. Jesus' death is a victory, and everything between the cross and the resurrection is this moment of heaven counting to 3. 1, 2, 3. And then the thing happens. Then he turns a grave into a garden. I just got to watch a movie that I've been waiting to watch for ages. My wife and I disagree on movies, in the sense that I like her movies, but she doesn't like mine. So we watch a lot of romantic comedies and things, and I'm fine with that. We know You've Got Mail by heart, but I've been waiting for ages to watch this new Quentin Tarantino movie called Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and it's been out for a while, so if you haven't seen it, I will ruin the end. So plug your ears, because you've had your time. I don't know what to tell you. You've plenty of time out there. But the story is amazing. It's the story of a fictional actor and his stuntman friend, and their experience of Hollywood back in some of the Hollywood golden age. But all the time, there's another story running alongside it, a real story. It's the really tragic story of the actress Sharon Tate, who was horribly murdered years and years ago. And so you've got these two stories running side by side. This story that you don't know, alongside a story that you do know. And what that means is all the way you have this deep horror of the story unpacking and unfolding. At some point, you know you're going to watch this tragic event, and it's heartbreaking. You can feel the thing coming. And it mirrors our story, that we know how that story ends. We know what it ends with, and of course, we're scared. And then Quentin Tarantino, being the genius that he is, at the end of this story, suddenly, it's happily ever after. Suddenly, she doesn't die. Suddenly, everything ends up okay. And you've waited and waited and waited as this story's unpacked, and suddenly it's not the ending that you expected. He's gone and he's done what's called retconning. It's retroactive continuity. He's gone and taken the story and he's changed it, and you don't see it coming. And this is what Jesus has done. It's retroactive continuity. He takes the story that always ends the same way, and this time it doesn't end the same way. The story, the human story that always ends in death, it suddenly ends in life. And that is what's so amazing about it. That's what makes this Jesus story different. This story ends in life. And the temptation in the church is to say that that story it's just about him. That Jesus' resurrection is just about him. But that's not true at all. In the Matthew story, the Matthew gospel, what happens is it says that in the moment Jesus comes back from the dead, all these other people rise with him. This story is about all of us with Jesus. It's about our stories as well as his. That you and I, we get to be a part of that. That death and the grave, they were terrifying. And in the light of the Easter story, they're suddenly not terrifying. In the light of the Easter story, everything changes. The story is different now. And you and I get to be a part of it. And so the question that I would have, that I would end with is, are you a part of it? And if not, why aren't you a part of it? Now, to quote the author, the speaker, Andy Stanley, I get people not believing it, but I don't get why you wouldn't want to believe it. This story seems almost too good to be true. How could you not want to? But maybe you've just struggled to believe it. And so I thought for a second, how can I give you a reason? Why do I believe this story? And one of the big reasons, other than the change in life that it's produced in me, is this. This story doesn't make sense. Who starts a faith that begins with a God that dies? A God that comes not to lord it over everyone, to put himself above everyone, but to make himself humble. Who takes a humble, dying God and says, this is what God looks like? And then who leaves that story in the hands of 3 women that won't be believed if they tell it, and seem too scared to tell it anyway? But they do tell it, and they are believed. And this story has changed lives for 2,000 years, and this story can change your life. And so when you walk through that final journey, through that thing that seems like the last thing, it's suddenly not the last thing. It's the thing before the last thing. And this God walks through it with you and says, I've been this way before. Death is just a shadow. It's not the real enemy. It's defeated. It's done. This God walked through that journey. He started with that, my God, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 22. He walks through the valley of the shadow of death with no fear in Psalm 23. And finally, he's the King of glory. He stands over these gates of hell, and he stands there victorious with Adam and Eve, one in each hand, and he says, I'm victorious over this thing. Jesus' death, it was a ransom on one hand, but it was also like a nuclear bomb. Jesus didn't whistle past the grave. He blew up the grave and changed the story forever. And that's what we celebrate this Easter. That's what you're invited into. I'm going to pray for us. God, thank you for Easter celebration. Thank you for the story that changes all stories, that changes our story. We wish we could be together this Easter. But at least the story holds true. You are risen from the dead, trampling over death by death, and those in the tombs bestowing life. Thank you.